Thank you, Mr. Wilson. There's a phrase which is only found one place in the Bible that I want to address today. If you would, let's turn over to Mark chapter 8, and we'll begin at the beginning of the chapter. I'm sure you all are familiar with this account. It is an account of the storm and the disciples not having enough food to eat. But it's important, I think, that we look at this one phrase and wonder why Christ used these words and how they might apply to us today. Mark chapter 8 and verse 1 begins, "In those days, the multitude being very great, and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said to them." So here's this large crowd of people who Christ has been teaching for 3 days. I wish we had all three of the days word for word for us. We don't. "I have compassion on them," verse 2, "on the multitude, because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat." So they followed him around the mountains, or perhaps came back to the same place for 3 days, but they'd come a distance to be there, and no doubt without refrigeration, they didn't carry coolers full of ice and pop cans, and they were probably getting short on everything, water and food. He said, "If I send them away hungry to their houses, they will faint on the way, for some of them have come from afar." They were willing to sacrifice to hear the words that Jesus Christ was teaching. Then his disciples answered him, "Well, how can one satisfy these people with bread in the wilderness? There's no bread out here. You can't go buy it." They were on the hills above the Sea of Galilee. And he asked them, "How many loaves do you have?" And they said, 7. Now, a loaf was probably kind of a round loaf of bread baked in an earthen oven. Would not have been as large, I don't think, as the large loaves of Wonder Bread that my mom used to buy so we could roll it up in balls and play catch with it when we were kids. But we don't eat. You wonder why they call it bread, was why they call it Wonder Bread. But smaller than that, probably half the size of a big loaf of what we used to call Wonder Bread. And they had 7 of those. He commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground. So they did not rush him when he gave food. He commanded them to sit down on the ground. He took 7 loaves and gave thanks and broke them and gave to them, to his disciples to set before them, and they set them before the multitude. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said to set them before them. So they ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. Now those who had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away. So he fed 4,000 people with these loaves and fish, and took up 7 baskets of fragments that were left over. Immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and came to the region of Dalmanutha. Now Dalmanutha was apparently right next door to Magdala, which was a town on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. So they went from about where Tiberias is, the 6 or 7 miles across the Sea of Galilee, to the shore of Magdala, which was where a very famous person came from. Her name was Mary Magdalene. That means a person who came from Magdala, just like Nazarene meant a person that came from Nazareth. So Mary Magdalene was Mary who came from Magdala. So that's where he went across the Sea of Galilee and went with his disciples in a boat over to the area of Magdala. Then the Pharisees came out, so there were Pharisees there that met him, and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. So they wanted him to do a magic event of some kind, and they probably had a list of things they wanted him to do, like, turn the water into whatever it might be. He sighed deeply in his spirit, because both the Pharisees and the Sadducees had demanded a sign from him. And he said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation." Which he changed a little bit later that said, "Well, we'll give you one sign." And that was the sign of being 3 days and 3 nights in the grave. So the Pharisees did not receive the answer that they wanted. Verse 13, he left them, and getting into the boat again, departed to the other side. So now they're going back across the Sea of Galilee, a different direction. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread. They got caught up in the discussion, apparently, and they did not take food with them, and they did not have more than 1 loaf with them in the boat. with obviously 13 or 14, who knows how many people were there, but at least 14 or 15. One loaf would not be enough to feed them on that trip. He charged them, saying, "Take heed." So Jesus looked at them and said, "Beware. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod." That's the only place in the Bible where the leaven of Herod occurs. The leaven of the Pharisees is mentioned in a number of other places, and no doubt all ministers in the Church of God have given sermons on the leaven of the Pharisees. We hear about that during unleavened bread, of self-righteousness, of following the tradition of men instead of following the laws of God. The Pharisees are still with us. They are Orthodox Jews. The religion of the Pharisees of Jerusalem in the first century, and their teachings were codified in the 200s to 700s AD in the form of the Mishnah and the Gemara, which combined became the Talmud. And that religion is still with us. But they had a self-righteous attitude. They certainly had replaced the laws of God with the laws of man. And we are, I think, as a group, fairly familiar with the leaven of the Pharisees. But what about the leaven of Herod? How much thought have you given to the leaven of Herod, and why Jesus would have warned each one of us to beware of that leaven? We'll go through a short survey of, we can't just talk about Herod the Great, although he was really the second in line if you go back to his father. But there are not one, not two, not five, not 10, there are 11 members of the Herod family specifically mentioned in the Gospels and Acts. So 11 different times Herod is referred to, although I think 2 of them are actually Salome, they're actually female, but there are at least 9 different men who are called by the name of Herod, because Herod is a family name, and also it was somewhat like ruler or Caesar. But Herod then is, the entire family has some sort of a trait or a proclivity or a teaching that we are all to be aware of. Now the name Herod, the Greek is Herodias, is a familiar one in the history of the Jews and the early Christian church. Some of what I'm reading here comes from BibleHistory.com and a couple other websites. The name itself signifies as heroic, a name not wholly applicable to the family, which was characterized by craft and knavery rather than heroism. The fortunes of the Herodian family are inseparably connected to the last flickerings of the flame of Judaism as a national power before it was extinguished in the Great Jewish War of Rebellion in 70 AD. The history of the Herodian family is not lacking in elements of greatness, but whatever these elements were, and in whomsoever found, they were in every case dimmed by the insufferable egotism which disfigured the family. Some of the Herodian princes were undeniably talented, but those talents wrongly used left marks for bad on the people of Israel. Of nearly all the kings of the house of Herod, it may be truly said that at their death they went without being desired, missed, or mourned. The entire family history is one of incessant brawls, suspicion, intrigue, shocking immorality. In the baleful and waning light of the rule of the Herodians, Christ lived and died. He was born into and lived in the world of the Herods and their domination and influence in Judea. And the foundations of the Christian church were laid in the years following Christ's death, which obviously were also dominated in Judea and Samaria and areas to the north by the descendants of Herod. The Herodians claimed to be, but were not of Jewish stock. Herod the Great encouraged the circulation of that legend because his mother was related to the Idumeans, and so he tried to claim Jewish ancestry through her. But the Idumeans were not bloodline Jews. They were Jews who they were Idumeans. Most of us are familiar with Petra, which was their capital city. They were Idumeans and Edomites who were forced to join Judaism, and they were forcibly circumcised in about the year 125 BC by a ruler named John Hyrcanus, and John Hyrcanus was a descendant of the Maccabees. And so the Maccabeans, which became known later as the Hasmoneans in the late 100s and the early 1st century BC, they then became a combination of high priest and ruler, civil ruler, king, and they forced these Idumeans, after they conquered Idumea, to take on the Jewish religion. And so when Herod claimed his descendant from his mother, who was, quote, Jewish, She was not a Jewish by birth, but by forced conversion. The Herod family originally sprang from a man named Antipas, who died in 78 BC. He was appointed governor of Idumea by Alexander Jannaeus, who was also one of the Hasmoneans. And he, of course, became one of the several early rulers in that time that were descendants of the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans, who were the descendants of those that came back with Ezra and Nehemiah in the earlier times as they came back from the travesty or the loss of Jerusalem in 586, and then the late 500s, early 400s came back and established their church in their nation of Israel, once again, Judah, in the land of Jerusalem. But the sad account in Nehemiah towards the end of the book is that they're very weak religiously. They want to go back to their own farms, constantly having to prod them to get done what they're supposed to be doing. The book of Malachi takes them to task, as does Haggai and Zechariah in about 100 years earlier time. So they were very weak, religiously speaking, but they wanted to reestablish the nation of Judah, and before long they had a lot of infighting, a lot of jealousy. They were taken over by the Greeks. Alexander the Great came through, and then later, of course, as his empire divided into four parts, the Seleucids to the north, which encompassed Jerusalem and Judea, and then just to the south, the Ptolemies, and those wars between those two nations that lasted for a number of decades. And they ended up with the Maccabean revolt of 167 BC, and then finally throwing off the Greeks. And so in about 162 BC, they became self-rulers. But during that time, the high priest and the priestly family became political, and they joined themselves with the Greeks. And it became the Pharisees, who were the descendants of the Maccabees, who rose against them and fought against the Greeks and against the priestly family in Jerusalem in order to establish temple worship again and to establish themselves as a nation. Now that's a summary, but I think most of you are familiar with it. So by the time the first century comes to its middle years, about 150 BC, the Maccabeans under Judas Maccabee, the sons of Matthias Maccabee, became then the rulers of Jerusalem and the area around Judea. And they ousted the high priests and the priestly families who had been basically in league with the Greeks and turned traitor against their own religion, and they established their dynasty called the Hasmonean dynasty. So the king became essentially the high priest, or the high priest that they appointed became king. And it's important to look at kind of how they claimed to fame. They claimed themselves to descend from Zadok, the high priest. Now, Zadok was the high priest during King David's time. He's very well written of in Scripture, because as time went on, they called themselves Zadokites, or the descendants of Zadok, as being in conflict with the Pharisees, what became the Pharisees, although they had a different name at that time. But these two groups later became the Pharisees, and the Zadokites became eventually the Zadokies, which was, as words often do, migrate into a slightly different spelling and pronunciation. They became what we call the Sadducees, or the descendants of Zadok, who claimed the priesthood and the high priesthood based on their claim to Zadok, but they were no longer the ones in political power. By the time Herod the Great came on the scene, he was born, I think, was it 50-something BC? No, I don't know, 70 BC, 60-something BC. Herod the Great, with a different environment and different character, he might have been worthy of the surname, but of course, all we have written about him, most of what we have written about him comes from Josephus. He was a young man when he became governor of Galilee, probably about 25 years old. And of course, he reigned in Judea for 42 years and died about the year 4 BC. He did a huge amount of building. His father, Antipas, was of the line of people that claimed the Zadok priestly line, but they kind of appointed themselves as priests more than actually did the work. His advance became very rapid, but the Herod family had as a great skill, and what became their claim to fame, or their reason for success, was they were able to join hands with the Romans. And they were able to make trips to Rome. They often were raised in Rome, became close friends with the household of Caesar, And whenever there was any trouble, and there was trouble frequently during these 2 centuries, the century and a half especially, they always ran to Rome, somehow became fast friends with the ruler of the time, and they got themselves appointed as king or ruler over Judea, Samaria, that whole area they wanted to rule, and they came back and conquered the territory or defeated their enemies. Happened a number of times. The first time was Herod the Great became a good friend of a man you are probably very familiar with, a man named Mark Antony, who was a second in command to Julius Caesar, became actually the kind of the governor of Rome and Italy while Julius Caesar was in Egypt for a couple of years. But Herod went to Rome and gained additional power in 41 BC. Anthony appointed him tetrarch of Judea. There were several factions who were striving to deal with the fact that the Romans had basically left town after Pompey the Great had attacked and conquered that area in 43 BC. And as most of you know, Pompey came to his end in the battle after the Battle of Pharsalus, and he was defeated by Julius Caesar, who then went to Egypt and kind of had this romantic encounter with the lady we call Cleopatra. And so Jerusalem and the environs were kind of abandoned by the Romans during this 4 to 6 year period when Julius Caesar first became the first consul of Rome, had a 10-year appointment as dictator, as the Roman law allowed to get actually the Roman law allowed for 6 months, but the Roman Constitution, then he got the Senate to appoint him for 10 years as complete dictator, and he finally got to the place where he didn't want to give it up and knew that if he turned loose as dictator, Rome would again fall into civil war, so Julius Caesar appointed himself as dictator for life, whereupon the Senate decided to assassinate him. You know all of that, but I thought I would repeat it, just kind of give you the time in which we live, or the time in which Herod lived, and that kind of tells you why Judea was sort of ignored by the Romans for this 4 or 5 year period after the Battle of Pharsalus. And so Herod then wanted to take over. There were several other armies, even the Parthians came in. So Herod went to Rome in 41 BC and was able to then be appointed by Antony and given an army, and he went back to conquer the land he had been given. Through the favor of Antony and also later of Augustus, he made friends with Emperor Augustus. He was made the king of Judea in 37 BC, and the ambition of his heart was finally made. He had to carve out his own empire, though, with the sword, and so for a second time he had to go back with an army, with the Roman army at his command, and take over that part of the world known as Judea and Samaria and the region around that. His first act of his reign was to exterminate the Hasmoneans, to which Herod himself was related through marriage to a lady named Marianne. He slew about 45 of the chief adherents. There were outrages. People sent complaints to Rome, but Herod was able to survive. When Antony, who had befriended Herod, was conquered by Augustus in the Battle of Actium, the sea battle of Actium in 31 BC, Herod was able then to, even though he was on the losing side, he was an ally of Antony, he was able to somehow get up and have an audience with Augustus, although at that time he wasn't named Augustus, he was named Octavian. He didn't take the name Augustus until later. So he met with Octavian after Actium and somehow convinced him that he would also be on his side. So how these guys were able to get into the good spot in support of the Romans is to this day a historical anomaly no one can figure out. Now, when he became in control of Jerusalem, this is where we get into some of the teachings and some of the, I think, aspects of Herod that Jesus was warning about. In his emulation of the habits and views of life of the Romans, he continually offended and defied his Jewish subjects by the introduction of Roman sports and heathen temples in his dominion. So he wanted to still be a Jew. He claimed to still obey the laws. He claimed to still he gave all sorts of temple donations. He rebuilt the temple in an effort to make the Jews like him. He had huge building projects. He was known as a great tax collector. The area was very, very wealthy, and so he had huge buildings built. Herodians built a massive harbor up at Caesarea, out of where there had been no harbor before. Built 3 large towers in Jerusalem. Herod was one of the greatest builders in history, but he was trying to combine Roman philosophy, Roman heathen temples, Roman practices with the Jewish religion because he wanted to have his political power. His influence on younger Jews grew. A distinct party arose, partly political and partly religious, which called themselves the Herodians. And the Herodians are even mentioned a couple times in scriptures. They were sort of the youth corps, you might say, of the followers of Herod, who wanted to be called Jews, wanted to participate in some of the temple ritual, perhaps even keep some of the holy days and the activities, but they also wanted to be very much Roman, to be in good graces with the Romans. They wanted Roman wealth, they wanted a lot of Roman activities, and they wanted to be a part of the government. So they were called the Herodians. They were a bitter offense to much of the nation, and they were associated at times with the Pharisees and the Sadducees in their opposition to Jesus Christ. In fact, they're mentioned 4 times in Scripture, once in Matthew and 3 times in Mark. Herod tried to win over the Jews, but that was in vain. He gave royal charity in times of famine. Whenever possible, he tried to mediate the conflicts and the disagreements among the various Jewish groups. The Jews saw him as a usurper of the throne of David and also a maintainer of strong arms, and he was known as a very quick aggressor of evil, or you might say of civil disobedience. If there was ever a law and order candidate or law and order ruler, it was Herod. He swiftly and severely punished anyone engaged in any sort of civil disobedience or disagreement with the rules which he put in place. He gave large gifts, large bribes to the Romans, and one of his most nefarious acts was he publicly broke open and robbed the tomb of King David, which had some treasures inside, and much of that was sent to Rome as an offering to them. And of course, the people never forgot it. Later, Herod had a loathsome disease, and he died in Jericho in about 4 BC after trying to commit suicide, apparently because the pain was so severe. His death then became, you might say, setting the tone for what happened in Jerusalem and in Judea for the next 50 to 70 years. And in fact, it was the family of Herod that dispersed around that area that formed the society, or the ruling part of society into which the New Testament framework begins. That's why there are so many Herods mentioned in the New Testament. By the final testament of Herod the Great, by the way, was the one that was ruler when Christ was born, and of course tried to have all the babies in Jerusalem, baby boys, killed because the wise men came to them, and he tricked them by saying he wanted to go worship when really what he wanted to do was kill anyone who might replace him or his sons. Herod was also known for being very brutal with his own family. He killed 1 or 2 of his own wives, several of his own kids, sons, whatever it might be. You can read all that history in Josephus. Now, by the final will of Herod, which had to be ratified by the emperor in Rome, the kingdom was divided. Archelaus received 1/2 the kingdom, with the title really of ethnarch. He governed Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. So Herod Archelaus, who was, I believe, the 2nd son of Herod the Great, is mentioned a number of times in scriptures. He was a person who was not very well liked or very well appreciated, but he was a ruler, and he certainly ruled during that time. Archelaus is one that we'll read about in just a few minutes in the scriptures. There was also Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great by Malthus, a Samaritan woman, half Idumean, half Samaritan. He had therefore not a drop of Jewish blood in his veins, and he was a tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. So when Christ was up in Galilee, which was to the north and east of Judea, there was a different Herod who was ruling. Now let's look at him over in Luke chapter 3 and verse 1. Luke doesn't give us, even such a good historian, but he doesn't always give us the second half of the name of some of these guys who were ruling. Luke chapter 3 and verse 1, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, so we know when that was, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of Iturea, the region of Trachonitis and Lysanias, and a tetrarch of Abilene. So this Herod that is mentioned here is simply Herod Antipas, not his brother Philip, who was obviously his brother. But Antipas is the ruler here, and he's mentioned. He's the one who did some very nefarious things. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 14 and verse 1. When Christ referred to Herod, this was up in Galilee. Matthew chapter 14 and verse 1, at that time Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus and said to his servants, this is John the Baptist, he's risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. So apparently Herod Antipas was somewhat superstitious. For Herod had laid hold on John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. There's not much known about Philip except that he had a wife that had already been married to another of the relatives who divorced him and became Philip's wife. Her name was Herodias, and then of course she was taken while she was still married to Philip by his stronger, politically stronger, and probably dominant brother, Herod Antipas, and was openly living with her. And John the Baptist had said to him in verse 4, it is not lawful for you to have her. Now, the reason John the Baptist could have said that, he wouldn't have said that to Caesar, he wouldn't have said it to Julius Caesar, he wouldn't have said it to any of the others, but the Herod family openly proclaimed they were following Jewish law, that they were following all the rules of not the Old Testament, but only the Torah, the first 5 books. Since they were religiously associated with the Sadducees, and the Sadducees in a number of articles or historical comments we have about them, records, only believed in the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The rest they thought were good history, but they did not believe in those books. Now, that's important to know. Why? Because in a number of the accounts in the Gospels, when Jesus Christ is talking to the Pharisees, he will quote prophets like Isaiah. He will quote Moses, but he also quotes prophets, and he quotes David in the Psalms. Did he not say, you are all gods? He's talking to the Pharisees. He's not talking to the Sadducees. When it says the Sadducees came to him, he says what? He says, it is written in your law. So he quotes only Genesis through Deuteronomy when he's talking to the Sadducees. So Christ knew that they only accepted the first 5 books of the Bible, whereas the Pharisees accepted the entire Old Testament up and through the prophets. So that's a sidelight, but there's an important distinction between the Pharisees and Sadducees, that when you read those accounts in the Gospels, it's kind of important to know who the audience is, because he is quoting an authority they acknowledged, even though he could easily have quoted Isaiah or David in the Psalms. But in the Pharisees, or in the Sadducees' mind, that would not have been an authority. So that's a sidelight, but I think it's important. So this is Herod Antipas, who was the ruler of that part of Galilee. He had arrested John the Baptist in Galilee. John had gone before him. Maybe it was in a casual conversation. Maybe it was at a holy day. Maybe it was at who knows what it was. But he had publicly told him, it is unlawful for you to have your brother's wife. Perhaps he quoted Leviticus 19, Leviticus 18, who knows. Verse 5, although he, meaning Herod, wanted to put him, John the Baptist, to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. And then we have the account of Herod's birthday being celebrated. The daughter of Herodias danced before them. So Herodias had a young daughter, probably 13, 14 years old, danced before him. Would have been his niece, by the way, which, well, very likely would have been his niece. By Philip would have been her father, but I'm just guessing, unless it would have been from her previous marriage. So what happened is in verse 8, she, having been prompted by her mother, said, give me John the Baptist's head on a platter. And the king was sorry, nevertheless, because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he commanded it to be given with him. So Jesus heard it, verse 13, he departed by there in a boat and departed to a place by himself. So he went off to mourn the death of John the Baptist. So John the Baptist was killed by this Herod, and this was Herod Antipas. He was very immoral. He was known for his cunning. Let's turn over to Luke chapter 13 and verse 31. Luke chapter 13 and verse 31. It mentions here, on that very day some Pharisees came out saying to him, get out and depart from here, for Herod wants to kill you. So the Pharisees were not as against Christ until the very end, and they were frankly not as vicious against him as the Sadducees were anyway. But until then, we have a warning here from some of these Pharisees and saying Herod wants to kill you. But notice verse 32. Jesus Christ said to them, go tell that fox. So go tell Herod, he's a fox. He thinks he's cunning. He thinks he's wise and smart. Behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today, and tomorrow, on the third day, I shall be perfected, or after 3 days. In other words, it would be a sign about him being in the grave 3 days and 3 nights. Nevertheless, I must journey today, tomorrow, and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish outside of Jerusalem. So basically, he's told Herod, I'm going to die. I'll be dead for 3 days, but I'm not going to die here in Judea. In Samaria. I'm going to go down and die in Jerusalem. Now, back to some secular history. After the death of Tiberius, Caligula became emperor, and when his scheming favored Herod Agrippa, the bitter enemy of Antipas, he had him made king in 37 AD. So Agrippa I is another Herod, and these Herods all were fighting amongst each other for more territory and a larger kingdom, more money, more influence, whatever it might be. If you've ever read the book I, Claudius, or Claudius the God, there are actually two of them, very well done historical novels about Emperor Claudius, who succeeded. He was the one that was limp, maybe probably had some sort of CP, but he walked with a severe limp, and therefore everybody thought he could never be emperor. But after the assassination of Caligula, the Roman Praetorian Guard proclaimed him as the new Caesar, which set the stage then for the Roman Praetorian Guard basically deciding who Caesar would be for the next 200 years, which ended up being kind of a bad thing because they took bribes, and it was not the best way to pass on rulership. At any rate, when Caligula died, Agrippa, who was a bitter enemy of Antipas, was made king in 37 AD. And then Herodias prevailed on Herod Antipas to accompany her to Rome to demand a similar favor. But the machinations of Agrippa and the accusations against him prevailed. Thus, it became his undoing. So eventually, Herod Antipas was sentenced to go to Lyon in modern-day France, back then called Gaul. And he died there not long after he killed John the Baptist, because Herod Agrippa I then was appointed in 37 AD to become the one who would take over. So we can assume that John the Baptist died about 31 AD, or about 28 AD. I'm just guessing, the first part of Christ's ministry. So about 9 years later, then Herod Antipas was sent off to France, or to Gaul, in exile, and that's where he died. Now, Herod Philip was the son of Herod the Great and Cleopatra of Jerusalem, not Cleopatra of Egypt. At the death of his father, Herod Philip inherited the area we call Lebanon. Galatia, Trachonitis, and Panias. Panias is where the headwaters of the Jordan River are. He died in 34 AD. His territory was given 3 years later to Agrippa I, his nephew and the son of Aristobulus, together with the tetrarchy of Lysanias. So Herod Agrippa I as he's called, there are actually two Agrippas in the Bible. Herod Agrippa I became the Herod who took over all the land of the other Herods. He did it through intrigue with the Romans and by being good friends with Caligula, and later with some of his followers, or some of the other Romans there. So we have at least four we've gone through. Herod Archelaus was the oldest son of Herod the Great, and of course he was he was one that actually controlled Judea when Jesus Christ lived there. Let's go over to Matthew chapter 2 and verse 22. This is all rather confusing, but if you have about 25 hours sometime, read the account in Josephus and kind of make a chart of who each one of these Herods are and what they did. It's actually a pretty good story, because all the killing and the intrigue and the betraying, so it would make a good TV series. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 22. When he heard, this is Joseph now is in Egypt. He'd fled to Egypt because Herod the Great was going to try to kill the baby Jesus. Verse 22 says, when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea instead of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned by God in a dream, he turned aside into the region of Galilee. Now, the reason that he was afraid was because Herod Archelaus, the oldest son of Herod the Great, also had a reputation for violent temper, for being very anxious to kill people, very, very willing to kill people. And so Joseph, then not going back to Judea, chose to go to a place called Nazareth and avoid being under the influence of that Herod. Now, Herod Agrippa I, called Agrippa by Josephus, was actually a grandson of Herod the Great. He was possessed of great shrewdness. He's very well recorded in history, raised primarily in Jerusalem in the house of Caesar. He was raised with Gaius Caligula, and when Caligula came to the throne, he, of course, was actually kind of rose right with him as a right-hand man. He was given Judea and Samaria in 40 A.D. Let's go over to Acts chapter 12 and verse 1, where he is mentioned. Acts chapter 12 and verse 1. Now, about that time, Herod the king stretched out his hand to harass some of his church. So Herod Archelaus was gone, Herod Antipas was gone, and their territories had now been given into the control of Herod Agrippa the first. I wish that in the New Testament translation they would give us all these guys' names so that we would know. We just read the word Herod, and some people, when they read this Herod, they think, oh, it must be Herod the Great. It's not. Herod the Great died in 4 BC. This takes place in the middle 30s or late 30s AD, so it's 40-some years later. So about that time, Herod Agrippa the king stretched out his hand to harass some of the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword because he saw that it pleased the Jews. Now keep in mind, these people are religious on the surface. They want to tell the Jews, I believe like you, I obey the Torah, I obey the first 5 books of the Bible, or we live by those laws. But he saw that it pleased the Jews to kill one of these Christian leaders, James, the brother of John, with the sword. Then he says he proceeded to seize Peter also, because Peter, James, and John were the ones who had been preaching in the temple. He says, now it was during the days of unleavened bread. So when they arrested him and put him in prison and delivered him to the 4 squads of soldiers to keep him, verse 5, Peter was therefore kept in prison, but constant prayer was offered to him, or offered to God for him by the church. And when Herod was about to bring him out, that night Peter was sleeping, bound with 2 chains between 2 soldiers, and the guards before the door were keeping the prison. Now behold, an angel of the Lord stood by him, and a light shone in the prison. And he struck Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, arise quickly, and the chains fell off his hands. So Peter was released from prison by these angels. Peter had come to himself, verse 11, now I know for certain that the Lord has sent his angel and has delivered me from the hand of Herod, that's Herod Agrippa the first, and from all the expectation of the Jewish people, because the Jewish people expected that he then would be the next one killed. But of course, that didn't happen. But what happened to Herod Agrippa? Well, it's recorded for us later in this chapter. Verse 20. Well, verse 19 says, when Herod had searched for him and not found him, he examined the guards, which means he had them brutally scourged, and commanded they should be put to death. And he went down from Judea to Caesarea and stayed there. Now Herod had been very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, but they came to him with one accord. Having made Blastus, the king's personal aide, their friend, they asked for peace, because their country was supplied with food by the king's country. So on a set day, Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, sat on his throne and gave an oration to them. So his grandfather had built this fabulous city in Caesarea, and he was down there to enjoy probably the weather and also the adoration of these people. Verse 22, the people kept shouting, the voice of a God and not of a man. Then immediately an angel of the Lord struck him, because he did not give glory to God, and was eaten by worms and died. So yes, he put James, the brother of John, to the sword, but not long after, the just God of the universe took justice, and Herod Agrippa died, being eaten up in his entrails of worms. Not a very nice ending for him. Herod Agrippa II was the son of Herod Agrippa I and Cypros, a lady named Cypros. His father died in 44 AD when he was only 17 years old and considered too young to assume government. Claudius therefore placed the country under the care of a procurator, and Agrippa had to wait. But he had not forgotten wholly these people in Jerusalem. Herod Agrippa, as he became of age then, took over his father's kingdom. He was probably the most openly religious of all the Herods. He was the one who would probably do more with going to the temple in Jerusalem, with giving alms, with doing all these things that were supposed to be endearing him to the people of Judea. Let's go over to Acts chapter 25. We'll begin in verse 13. This, of course, is where Paul is appealing to Caesar, and one of the rulers named Festus, he's brought before here at Caesarea. Paul sat in front of the judgment seat. Acts chapter 25 and verse 13. After some days, King Agrippa, this is King Agrippa II. So again, this would be nice when the Bible was translated if they would put down the last name and whoever of this guy. This is King Agrippa II. This is the son of the Agrippa that died of worms after killing James, the brother of John, one of the apostles. So after some days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. This is the same place where his father had died. And they began there many days. Festus said, or laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there is a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me when I was in Jerusalem asking for a judgment against him. So he goes through kind of a long dissertation about what the Apostle Paul was accused of and that he'd appealed to Caesar. Let's go down to verse, very towards the end of the chapter. Verse 25, when I found that he had committed nothing deserving of death, that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I decided to send him. So verse 26, or chapter 26 and verse 1, Paul appears before Agrippa II. Paul said, or Agrippa said, you are permitted to speak for yourself. So Paul stretched out his hand and answered for himself. I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning all things of which I'm accused of the Jews. In verse 4, he talks about his manner of life. He talks about following God. Verse 7, he says, for this hope's sake, the hope of God's kingdom, King Agrippa, I am accused of the Jews. He talks about his trip where he was struck down on the road to Damascus. In verse 12, journeying to Damascus. He reiterated in verses 14 to 18 the words that Jesus had talked to him when he was called there on the road to Damascus. Now, verse 21, he says, for these reasons the Jews seized me in the temple and tried to kill me. Therefore, having obtained help from God to this day, in other words, he'd avoided the Jews arresting him and killing him to this day, I stand witnessing both to great and small, saying no other things than those which the prophets and Moses said would come. So he appeals to Moses there, which of course Agrippa would have agreed with. Verse 27, though, he says, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? He included Moses in the prophets. He says, I know that you do believe. Strange statement. I wish we had more detail. The Apostle Paul says to King Herod Agrippa II, who had inherited this kingdom after his father died of worms, and he essentially controlled most of what we call Israel or the Palestine area today, everything from pretty much from Egypt all the way up to northern Lebanon over to Syria. He says, I know that you do believe the prophets, meaning Moses and the prophets. So he was an openly religious, at least wise he proclaimed religious belief, practice. Then Agrippa said to Paul, you almost persuade me to become a Christian. There we have the leaven of Herod in a nutshell. On the surface, they proclaimed they believed in God, they believed the Bible, but when it came right down to it, they wouldn't actually live it, they wouldn't actually believe it. It was simply a matter of political, getting by, political accommodation to have the life they wanted now physically. In other words, they were a friend of the world more than a follower of God. But they used the label, they used the paint, the outside covering, the assertion of being religious so the Jews wouldn't not support them. But they also, in reality, became to the core Romans, so the Romans would let them have their kingdom and would not take it away from them. Let's go down to John chapter 11. The Sadducees, not the Pharisees, were the ones who conducted the trial of Jesus Christ. The Sadducees, who didn't believe many of the teachings of Scripture, also sought signs, were the ones who were the descendants of the Hasmoneans, who then became the descendants of, well, the ones who took over and were put in place and allowed to be high priests by Herod. By this time, instead of having a high priest who lived his life and then died and his son took over, there was a family, the family of Ananias, the high priest. Josephus calls him Ananias. He had 5 sons, and each of his 5 sons would serve 1 year after the other. So the year Jesus Christ was arrested and crucified, a man named Caiaphas was high priest that year because he was one of the 5 sons of the high priest appointed by Herod, who then rotated year after year the office of high priest. It was a political office, not necessarily a religious one. But they were the ones, the Sadducees, who were in charge of the temple and controlled all of the activities around the Temple Mount. John chapter 11 and verse 49 sets the stage and tells us something else about these Sadducees, these Herodians, these people who were in league politically with the Herods. The chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, "What shall we do? For this man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and nation." And then one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish." So they knew what the Roman emperors did to those who would defy Rome's authority. They knew that Julius Caesar had killed 1.1 million people in his conquest of Gaul, and that every time there was a rebellion or there were those in defiance of Rome's authority, that the sword came swiftly and the sword came brutally, and blood flowed down the streets. And so they were very concerned that if Jesus Christ were proclaimed King of Kings or King of the world or King of Judea or King of whatever it was, the Romans would then come in and take notice our place and nation. Now, what happens when you put something in front of God that's more important to you than God is? Guess what? You lose it. What happened to them in 70 AD? The Romans came and took away their place and their nation. They had a period of about 40 years, about 37, 38, when God gave them a chance to repent. There were a few, obviously, warnings given to them by the apostles during that time. But the Romans did come and take away their place and their nation. But had they acknowledged Jesus Christ, that may not have happened. Certainly would not have happened in the same way. Now, just a little bit of historical background. Of the 3 major groups of Jews in Jerusalem that are mentioned in the Bible, they are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Josephus also mentions them. They were the groups that fought amongst each other quite often. There are stories of little battles where 10 or 20 or 30 would kill one or the other. The Pharisees were incensed at the Sadducean policy of dealing with the Romans, making agreements, doing Herod's dirty work, pretending they were Roman in some ways, even perhaps bringing in idolatry and various forms of sun worship, and accommodating and what the Pharisees felt was evil. The Essenes were sort of aligned with the Pharisees, but if you read the book about the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, you find these guys were fighting each other until the Roman armies surrounded Jerusalem. Then they fought the Romans, but as soon as the Romans left, they started fighting each other. But during that siege of 70 AD, by that time, the Sadducees were almost extinct. We hear no more about them after the 70 AD is over, after the dispersion of the Jews. Now, there's some reasons for that. Let's go over to, let me see, I want to go to the one in Acts, but let's maybe, for the sake of time here, let's go over to Acts, I think it's 25. And we see this is the case where Paul, very wisely, mentioned here, of course, that he was not, that they didn't believe in the resurrection. The Pharisees did not believe in the resurrection. They just simply didn't believe it. Let's go see. Is this the one I want? I want to make sure I get this right here. I think I may have written that down wrong. Well, this is not what I planned on, but this happens. Yeah, that's the tour only. There's way too many notes here. I don't have time for it. It's already getting a little bit on time. Well, let's go over a couple other places. We'll get back there in a minute. They all sought signs in Matthew 22 and verse 23. But let's go over to Matthew chapter 26. We'll continue on the trial here, Matthew chapter 26. Let's begin in verse 57. Matthew 26 and verse 57. Those who had laid all hold of Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and elders were assembled. Peter followed him at a distance to the high priest's courtyard and went in and sat with the servants and to see the end. And the chief priests and the elders and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death. So first he went, when he was arrested, to the house of Caiaphas, that same high priest who was so concerned with the earthly kingdom. And down in verse 63, Jesus kept silent, and the high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And of course, Jesus answered him, It is as you say, nevertheless I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And so the high priest said, well, he spoke in blasphemy, but it's interesting that Christ told the high priest exactly who he was and exactly what would be happening in the future. So it's kind of interesting that he would do that, because he had a very, obviously he had a very, not a good relationship with those Sadducees, but certainly had a time when they would be against him. And of course, this case, they're trying to make him completely out of the picture. They want to remove him completely out of the picture. The time we have left, I want to ask you, what does friendship with the world look like? Let's go over to James chapter 4 and verse 4. Because the leaven of Herod, which is also referred to as the leaven of the Sadducees, as separate from the leaven of the Pharisees in the accounts in Matthew and Luke, is very simply accommodation with the world. Being a friend of the world while trying to, on the surface, act religious or proclaim being religious. The Pharisees' leaven's much different. The Pharisees simply took traditions of men and replaced the laws of God, and their traditions oftentimes were far more stringent, or they felt far more specific in obeying God. But the Sadducees tried to accommodate both. They didn't believe in the resurrection. They did not believe there was a spirit world. They simply believed in the physical here and now. And they believed in being part of this world's society and in league with this world's governments and rulers, so they could, quote, have their best life now. And I'm pulling that quote from somebody else, and I won't mention who or why, but I believe it's the same philosophy. James chapter 4 and verse 4, adulterers and adulteresses, don't you know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? So the Sadducees tried to be friends with the world. They tried to be friends with Herod. They tried to be friends with the Romans. They tried to be friends with the Jews. They tried to be friends with everybody, and indeed they ended up being friends with nobody, because they were turned on by the Romans, they were turned on by their fellow Jews, and they eventually disappeared from history. Over in chapter 1 of James and verse 8, this may be the SPS of the book of James. He said, he was a double-minded man, unstable in all ways. He's talking to those who were doubting, who were double-minded. If anything, the Sadducees and the Herodians were double-minded. They wanted to be a part of the world. They wanted to be a part and enjoy all they could in this life physically. They did not want to live for a future kingdom because they didn't believe in it. And they simply were people who were of two minds. Now, the warning for us is very obvious. That we are not to be double-minded. We are not to be going to and fro. That we're not to be coveting this world and what it has, not to be part of this world society, because it is certainly coming to an end. If James warns us against being friends of the world, what does friendship with the world look like? Why is it even wrong? John 3:16 says, God loves the world. God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son. But can you love someone without being their friend and being a part of what they do or getting involved in their activities? Well, the friendship with the world looks like what it is, which is worldliness. Christ said to love your enemies, but he also did not say be a partaker of what they do. And of course, they don't. Let's go over to John chapter 12 and verse 25. On his last night before he was betrayed, Jesus did talk quite a bit about coming out of the world. He said, I send you out into the world, and they will treat you just like they treated me. They will receive you like they have received me. And of course, pretty much they didn't, except a very small number. In John chapter 12 and verse 25, it says, he who loves his life will lose it. He who hates, Greek word simply means by comparison, prefers something else, hates this life and this world will keep it for eternal life. So the Pharisees loved this life and they lost it. They did not prefer the future, the spiritual, ahead of what was here now. They tried to accommodate both. Verse 26 says, if anyone serves me, let him follow me where I am. There my servant will be also. So we have a wonderful message that we are to be following him wherever he goes, not to have friendship of the world. Let's continue in John to something I think is very important. Let's go to John chapter 15. John chapter 15 and verse 15. Well, let's start in verse 14. He's talking about the difference between friends and servants. You are my friends if you do whatever I command you. So we can be his friends. Word philia. Philia means friendship, a loving friendship. If you do whatever I command you. No longer do I call you servants. For a servant does not know what his master is doing. You see, the difference is knowledge. Knowledge revealed from the master to the person who's doing his work. We are servants of Jesus Christ. He wants us all to do that, but he says we are more than that. We are his friends because we do what he commands us to do. He says, I have called you friends, for all things that I heard from my Father, I have made known to you. Now, what he's describing is the basis of true friendship. True friendship occurs between two people who share personal things, who spend time together, not just in a superficial way, but actually share meaningful thoughts, meaningful exchanges, meaningful events. It's wonderful to see a husband and wife who have been married many, many years who really are their best friends to each other, because you can tell through the years they have shared so much and have grown together, and they really are best friends. There are marriages, sadly, where there may have been some sparks and some interests, but they never became best friends and learned to share those things with each other. I've heard some psychological authorities or professors say that if you have 3 close friends during your lifetime, that's the best you can hope for. Hardly anyone has more than 3. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm just passing on what I've heard. But what we do know from the Bible is very clear from what Jesus Christ said, all things I heard from my Father I have made known to you. And that's the difference between a servant and a friend. A true friend makes known his personal things and things that he's known from his Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain, that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give you. So this basis of true friendship results in answered prayers and an invitation to be a part of the family, not just with our elder brother, but also with the Father. Friendship with the world looks like becoming a part of the world. Why did Jesus Christ not reveal his true feelings from his Father and special truth from his Father to the world? Let's go over to John chapter 2 and verse 24. Jesus Christ had a relationship with the world, but it was not the same relationship as he had with his disciples. That's the overall purpose of those 4 monumental chapters in the book of John that we read every year before Passover, to show that the relationship with those whom he has called and called to be his philia, his friends, is different than his relationship with the world. John chapter 2, let's begin in verse 24. Jesus did not commit himself to them. Just talking about the crowds and those others who were there in Jerusalem at that earlier Passover, because he knew all men. In other words, he knows human nature, and he knew that it was not their time. He knew that he was not to cast pearls before swine. He knew all men, and had no need that anyone should testify of man, for he knew what was in man. So Jesus Christ knew clearly human nature, and he knew that his relationship with the world was not going to be the same as it was going to be with his true friends, who were the disciples that he was to call. Now, the friends of the world lack intimacy with God. They don't draw near to him, but Jesus Christ has invited us to draw near. Let's just go over to Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 22. I know it's a verse you're very familiar with, but we are to draw near to God. We're not to be partakers of other men's sins, not to be a part of the God of this age, but we simply are to draw near to God. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 22, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. That's the requirement for being a friend instead of a servant. To have your hearts sprinkled or removed from an evil conscience, which was referred to in John 2. Christ knew what was in all men. Heart that's desperately wicked, who can know it? And your bodies washed with pure water, which means the outward show of repentance and been baptized and receiving of God's Spirit. Very important that we understand the Sadducees partook of this world and also pretended to be religious. Let's go over to Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 11. Paul warned about the same thing. He warned not to have the label of a Christian, but then to have fellowship with the works of darkness. It was a tempting thing for them. It's a temptation that take place today. You can have fellowship with works of darkness while you're alone watching improper entertainment or for being a part of something that we know is sinful. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 11, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. This is exactly the opposite of Sadduceeism. They had fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness and didn't expose them. But then they went outside and pretended to be adhering to the first 5 books of the Bible, which of course include such things as the 2 great commandments, and the commandments repeated over and over to have their heart and love God with all of their heart and all of their being and all of their soul. So they didn't obey that. Notice verse 12, it is shameful even to speak of those things which are done by them in secret. So it's even a shame to talk of those things that happen in secret, even though in our world it certainly seems to be published all of the time. Eventually, being a friend of the world, having it both ways, results in things like the experience of Lot, where he became part of Sodom and eventually was willing to give up his daughters. Let's go over to 1 John chapter 4, and we'll end there for today. 1 John chapter 4 and verse 17. Jesus Christ lived in the world, but he only became friends with his disciples. He only shared those things that broke down the barrier from servant to friend with those who had willingly followed him and repented and willingly wanted to obey him truly with all their heart. 1 John chapter 4 and verse 17 says, love has been perfected among us in this way, that we may have boldness in the day of judgment. In other words, have confidence in the time of the resurrection and the return of Christ. Notice this last part of this verse, though, because as he is, so are we in this world. So as Christ lived in this world, understanding human nature, but only becoming friends with those who were going to be part of his family, living under the rule of the Romans, living under the authority of the high priest, even though that high priest was certainly not a religious or a converted individual, he gave honor where honor was due, respect where respect was due, but he was not a partaker in other man's sins and did not become a part of this society. It says, he who fears has not been made perfect in love. That's verse 18. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because servants fear, but friends don't. So we're to live as he is in this world, and to make sure that we understand that friendship with the world will cause us to sacrifice all that we have. We'll be like the Romans, we'll be like the Jews who lost everything in 70 AD. So beware of the leaven of Herod.